I'm excited. So my name is Dr. Jonathan Cresci. I am the owner and operator of Fundamental Sounds, which is a audio production and education company, and also now a record label, which just became true like 3 months ago. So today I also teach at Frederick Community College, where I am the program manager for audio production. And I've been doing this for, I don't know, 20 years. Which is a long time, since 1997. So what I'm doing here today is I'm giving a bunch of lectures. So like this is the first in 5. The first one today is about reverb and creating spaces, which is fantastic that it's in this room, because we have lots of it. And then we will be doing, well, let me give you a shout out for the guy who's doing a compression lecture. Make sure you go to his at 12:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. So I will be there because, man, someone's going to have to sit in that auditorium. And unfortunately, it is in the middle of the Mega Man concert. So, you know, you can always go back, I guess. I've never been to a concert there. But I will also be doing a lecture on EQ. And then we're doing voiceover work, how to do better voiceovers. So for whatever I have a bunch of microphones. I'll have people come up and read, and we'll talk about compression and all of that. It's down in the makerspace. And then we're going to do a mastering panel in the makerspace, how you can master music to modern standards, which is a lot different than the old way of doing things. So that's what you have to look forward to. But today we are going to be talking about creating space. So, yes, like space. There you go. It's fantastic. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. I'm very loud. So, what I wanted to talk about is what is reverb, why we use it, what it can do, and how we can use it in a professional way. Okay? A lot of times, like if you were recounting a story of GarageBand and throwing reverb on it and how they do it, but there's a very particular way that they use it in a professional context that a lot of people aren't doing. At least the students that I see at Frederick don't know how to do it. But there's also a time to do it other ways, and there's different kinds of reverb, and what does all of that mean? Originally, you were going to listen to different kinds of reverb, but unfortunately, in this room, it's all going to sound like this reverb. But this is fine, because this is like a hall. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is how do we perceive space? Like, how do you know where you are? As an animal, we use our eyes, but when we don't have our eyes, we use our ears. And we use both time and intensity cues. Okay, so what that means is we use how loud something is and how long it takes it to get to our ear to determine where it is. So for instance, if you use if you go to an anechoic chamber. An anechoic chamber is a room that has no echo. It's anechoic. Has no echo. You go into something like that, I've never been in one, so I don't know if this is true, but people say that within 20-ish minutes you will get sick because your brain no longer has those echoes to tell it where it is. So it doesn't know whether you're standing up or whether you're laying down. Your eyes are telling it what's happening, but your brain can't tell because there's no echoes. And they use anechoic chambers to test microphones and speakers. And if, like cars, they will drive a car into an anechoic chamber in order to test how noise enters the car and how much noise the car produces and things like that. So we use time. Time is how long it takes sound to get to our ears. Okay, so we have things called delay. By the way, reverberation and delay are what we call time-based frequency processing. Right? There are 3 things there's 8 things that make up sound, but 3 things that we talk about a lot. One is dynamics, which again, plug in the dude who's doing the compression lecture. He's doing dynamic-based frequency processing. Okay? We right now are doing time-based frequency processing, or time-based processing, And then you will get frequency-based processing, which is where your equalization comes in. Okay? And each one operates on a separate characteristic of sound. So we're dealing with time. So time, we can use something like delay, where you have a source that's not delayed, that comes straight to your ear, and then we delay that a little while, and that would be an echo. So when you hear my voice echoing off the back wall, that is a delay. That's an echo. You're hearing the reflection. We also have intensity cues. How loud is something, right? If I come up right next to you and I yell at you in your face, you're going to know that I'm right next to you, right? Not only because I'm loud, but because my voice is getting to your ears very quickly. Okay? If I whisper, though, it's very low in intensity. But because I'm so close, again, that time factor makes it close. So, like if we look at this in context of modern pop music, a lot of modern pop music, when compared to older music, and we're not talking super old, we're talking like 20, 30, 40 years old pop music. That music tended to have a lot of echo attached to it. Nowadays, what do you guys think? I mean, when you listen to modern pop music, do you hear a lot of reverberation or do you hear very little? Very up front, really up here. Yes, super punchy. And no matter what they do, right? If they're whispering or if they're yelling, it's all right here. And part of that could be part of the genre, right? I have a couple hip hop artists and they want very little reverberation on their vocals because they want that aggression. They want that upfrontness. Whereas I was playing a couple tunes from a band that basically is a throwback 70s band made by people who weren't even born in the 70s. And they want reverb all over the place because they want it to sound like Thin Lizzy. And so it all depends on the genre and it depends on the time in which you're at. Right now, a lot of people don't even use reverb, they just use delay. Very, very small amounts of it. So we have time and intensity cues. So how do we quantify space? How do we know, how are we making it? Because whenever you have reverb, let me take this off. It's in there. What's our goal with reverb? Anybody? To fill a space. To create depth, to create an illusion. Yes, all of that is correct. So creating a space to create depth is to create an illusion of space. Because when you're thinking about this, right, we're in the context, how many of you are music makers? Fantastic. How many of you are video game makers? Okay, good, sort of. Good. I have no idea how to do that, so it's fantastic. So the video game maker people need to talk to the people who make the music. That's what this is all for. That would be awesome. But the people who make music, we don't have, when you make music, just flat out, we don't have any visual context to that music. It's all in our head, right? When you listen to something, you hear it, but we create what we call this what do I want to call it? I don't know what we call it. We create an illusion. We create fake depth. We create a fake room. We create fake things that when we close our eyes, we can see, okay, guitarist, lead guitarist is on the right, rhythm guitarist is on the left. We have right up the center, we have bass, kick drum, snare, vocalist. We can see that. And then when we use reverberation, we can create a space around it. Now, some recordings don't do that. I started out my business, a little bit of background on me is I went to school at Peabody Conservatory where I learned how to play trumpet and I learned recording arts and sciences, okay? And yep, trumpet represent, that's right. So where I learned recording arts and sciences. And so what I did was for the first, 5 years of my career, I recorded orchestras, orchestral works, small ensembles, and audition tapes. Lots and lots and lots of audition tapes. And so I became versed in using a space like this because I didn't use fake reverb. We had a hall. So depending on where I put the microphones, I could use the hall as my reverberation. But when you go into a pop music situation, or even a modern classical situation to some extent, right? You go into a studio. And let's face it, studios that have big spaces don't last very long in this industry anymore, right? It's just too expensive. And so now everything is very close mic. Everything is very small and close. And the closer you mic something, the less space you have around that something. Usually we do it, one, to control it, and two, because we don't want the space around it. How many of you have played the game Wonder Boy, the new one, like the remake? Anybody? That's what it's called, right, Tom? Wonder Boy? The Dragon Strap? I highly recommend this game, mainly because when you get to the end of it, you get to look at the recording session that they used to record all of the music, the background music, because they took all the 8-bit music and turned it into like a string chamber group. And when I was talking, when I was playing with Tom over there, I was listening going, wow, this sounds like it's really nice, but it sounds like it was recorded in a basement. Yep, that's where it was recorded, in a basement, because that's what it sounded like, because the room around it gave it that sound, right? And so they didn't use any artificial reverb to try to mask that. So how do we quantize this space that we're trying to do? Well, you have a couple things. So here's my brilliant diagram of a square and a speaker with a head. First thing, how close we are is the direct sound. Okay, so this is direct. This is the dry sound. The closer you get to me, the more dry sound you will hear. The further away you are as you go back into the hall, the less direct sound you will hear and the more reverberation you will hear. So this determines how close you are. Then you have what are called early reflections. By the way, most of our reverb programs are plugins, whether they're VSTs, audio units, or the new AAX, whatever Pro Tools uses. They have these particular things. They have direct sound, which is considered the dry sound. They have the reverberant sound, which is considered the wet sound. And then it has these other aspects. Early reflections is one of them. Early reflections, which this room does not have many of, tells you how wide a room is. It can also put depth behind a microphone. So if this is the microphone here and I'm speaking into it, right, I can put depth back here, because that's all close to where the head is. Very, very close and early. Very short. Then you have the late reflections. This room's got plenty of those. That was a good, 1.7 seconds. A lot. So we have the reflection of my voice. My voice goes out, hits the back wall, comes back, hits this wall, comes back. Here. All of those. And they scatter all over the place, but I'm doing this on one plane. So this is the late reflections. This gives us depth, gives us a back wall, it gives us length. That's a late reflection. Early reflections give us space around us, tight space, and late reflections give us depth. Now, there's something that's in every single reverb program, and it's called pre-delay. And what pre-delay does is it delays the reverberant sound a given amount, so you hear the direct sound first, and then you hear the reverberant sound. And what that does is it helps make things very upfront. Because if you think about it, this is that time aspect of things. The closer you are to somebody, the quicker you're going to hear that direct sound hit your ears. And then you'll hear the late reflection, you'll hear the late and early reflections happen later. Now, the way we think about this is sound travels at 1,130 feet per second. Okay? Roughly, unless you're in Colorado. Okay? So 1,130 feet per second, which means approximately you can go about 10 feet in 11 milliseconds. So if you have a pre-delay of 11 milliseconds, it's going to sound like your reverb is very far away. So you can actually judge how far away you are by the changing of this pre-delay. So pre-delay helps us have intelligibility to our sound. So if you just have reverb washing over your vocals, it just washes over it. It may sound pleasant, but we may not be able to hear what you're saying. So what do? We throw a little bit of pre-delay into it, and now all of a sudden, your voice happens a split second before the reverb happens. So you still get the lushness, but you still get the intelligibility. And it's also very helpful if you time the pre-delay to the beat of your song so that everything sort of pumps at the same time. And you can go online and find out how many milliseconds a quarter note is at 120 beats per second. Okay? Beat per minute, I should say. The other two concepts that you want to know about this is diffuse field and free field. The free field is, right now, you all can, so when you listen to me speak right now, do you hear more reflection or more voice when you're hearing me speak? Right, but you hear the voice pretty clear, right? To some extent. For probably the first front row, maybe as you get further back, it gets worse, right? And so what happens, the people in the front row are in the free field. That's where the dry sound is louder than the reflected sound. That means you're closer to something. The diffuse field is when you move back, right? And all of a sudden now, the reverberant room is bigger. Like you hear more reverberation and less direct sound. This was quantified, I mean, it's been quantified for a long time, but people use this in the early days of surround sound. Because what did they do? They wanted to make a surround sound recording of the New York Philharmonic. So they put microphones out in the background, like out in the middle of the hall. I don't really know why, but they did, right? And so they said, well, but we put these microphones out there and it sounds worse. And you're like, well, yeah, because they're really far away. And they're like, well, how do we make these not sound worse? Well, we'll go in and we'll tweak the microphones to exist out there. The unfortunate part about that is that those microphones then became the commonplace microphones that everybody uses because no one understands this. So now we've lost free field microphones, right? It's actually kind of funny. Like a free field microphone costs twice as much money to make work than the diffuse field microphones. And so now we have a lot of those. And by the way, what that means is not to get too far into the weeds about frequency, but the further you go away from a direct sound, the darker it gets. Meaning the less high frequencies there are. If you were right up here, you'd say, man, your voice is really nasty sounding, but you're back there, it sounds kind of okay, right? Because all of that high frequency rolls off. And so the further away you are, the darker it is. So those diffuse field microphones have this high frequency boost to try to balance out what happens back there. But they talked about this because they were creating these surround sound things. I mean, surround sound's a big deal now, right? Because VR is a big deal. There's VR panels here, right? We are like in the audio world, we're bringing back 70s technology to do this VR stuff. Anybody who tells you that they're using these tetrasonic microphones, that, oh, this is brand new technology. No, 1972. Yeah, it's quadraphonic. Yeah, they had specialty reel-to-reel tape recorders that you could listen to quadraphonic sound. And basically what it is it was surround sound for headphones. Because in the 70s, headphones were awesome. Everybody used headphones. And then it was like, no, you got to have, like it went big speakers to headphones to big speakers, and now it's back on headphones again, right? And so now we're looking for that surround sound feel with headphones. And so they use these tetrasonic microphones that create that. How many of you have ever listened on YouTube? What is it called? ADSR stuff? I think that's what it is. ASMR, that's what it is. Where they like scratch their head or the balloon or something and it feels like it's happening. It's like really weird stuff. That's what we're talking about with these microphones. As soon as people will buy mannequin heads and put microphones in the ears to create these like, well, this is what it would sound like if I was clipping your hair. And you're like, that's gross. I don't want this. But some people really enjoy it, I guess. So there you go. I mean, you know, whatever. New panel. SMR panel. But we now use reverb to do the same thing. So we actually have to put people in spaces. And it's been done in the movies a lot, because whether you know it or not, lines are screwed up. They add lines later, and they will come back, put it in a voiceover booth, have the person read it, and then they have to go and put that person back in the space where they were when they said the lines. Right? That's tough. And so they will use reverberation techniques, which I'll show you today, in order to do that. Okay? So we have 6 reverberation types, 6 reverb types. So the first one, you're in it. Right? It's an analog reverb type, and that is this. Sorry. This is reverb. We're in a space. You could choose to record in a space, and you would get that. So for instance, you want that, I guess it's Led Zeppelin 4, like fat John Bonham drum tone, then you're going to have to record your drums in a hallway. Well, it's not a hallway. It was well, sort of, right? It was like I want to call it an atrium, but it was like where you walked into the house, and then there was a grand staircase. And, a foyer. That's it. It was a foyer. And they hung the microphones from the balcony of the foyer, and he sat there and he played, and it sounded like boom, 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 all of this reverberation everywhere. And everyone's like, wow, how'd you get that? Well, we recorded it in the hallway, in a foyer. That's what we did. So they used their space to create a sound. And sometimes you have to do that, right? I record people everywhere. One of my bands, they practice in an abandoned building in Frederick. I won't say which building in case somebody kicks them out. And that's where we recorded their record, because we couldn't afford recording space. So I brought all my gear into this abandoned building, and that's where we recorded it. And I mean, people do it all the time. So halls are the first analog thing that we have, but they're big. How many recording studios have the ability to have one of these? Probably not a lot. So they started using things like these, which are chambers. I just got that off the internet. It looks like a really scary place. But Capitol Studios in New York, and I believe also in Los Angeles, have rooms. Now in Capitol in New York, they are actually in the bedrock, right? They're in the granite. But they can't use them anymore because the subway runs 24 hours a day, which in the old days it did not. And so you constantly get background rumble from the subway. But these, they would have a room that was cement like this. And then they would have a room that had wood. And then they would have a room that was, had different kinds of paneling. And you could go down there and you could tweak the room and do this. Now, you ask yourself, how does someone use a real chamber? Well, No, not that way. I mean, that's up to you, man, if you want to use a chamber like that. But no, to use it for reverb. Well, no, the question is how does someone use a real space, like a hall or a chamber, to actually add reverb to your recording? Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that's a really important thing to understand. So what he said was, if you didn't hear it, was that either you put someone in there, okay, which didn't happen very often, but what you could do is you could have that person in the studio playing on their guitar. And that guitar would then run into the console and run out of the console into the chamber. It would then be played through a speaker in the chamber, and then a microphone, which was strategically placed in the chamber, would pick up the reverberation. That reverberation, which was the wet sound, would be brought back into the console and blended in. That's how it was done. Exactly. Huge, right? So people didn't have these. So what did they do? We're going to invent something that's smaller yet still incredibly large. Okay? This is what is called a plate. It is called a plate because it is a plate. It is a plate. It is a steel plate. Sometimes they are different kinds of plates, but let's just go with the steel one. This is actually a picture of someone selling an EMT 140 plate. They are approximately 8 feet long, and they're about, well, I don't know, this one seems to be more like 11 by 6. But they're pretty large. And what they did was they said, we need a way of creating a smaller, more portable version of a hall. And yes, this was their smaller and portable version of that. A box with a plate in it. And it does have wheels, although I didn't come with wheels. Those are just for the picture. So what they did was they put a speaker, a transducer, something that changes electrical energy into acoustical energy. And that's what's in the middle there. I don't know if I can nope, can't do it. So it's in the middle. And what happens is they play the sound into that speaker. That speaker then vibrates the plate. And then there are 2 guitar pickups on either side, piezo pickups on either side, and those pick up the vibrations of the plate. And that becomes your reverberation. Problem is plates don't have any early reflections. All they have are late reflections. So they're very one-dimensional. However, that is what you typically hear on a lot of recordings, is plate reverbs, because people didn't have rooms to do it. Now, if you couldn't afford a plate reverb, then you would use something called a spring reverb, which was a spring. Okay, and so any of you play guitar? Electric guitar, and your amp has spring reverb in it? Yeah, that's what's in it. Well, not that. That's an AKG spring reverb, which is really expensive. You have like a little tank that has springs in it. And what happens is you excite the spring, and it vibrates, and you have a pickup in there to pick up that vibration. And that is your reverb. Yes, exactly. You can also use a slinky to make one of these. A metal slinky, but not a plastic slinky. Okay? So, what we've just done is we have 4 analog types. We have real halls and real chambers, and then we have plates that are supposed to replicate halls, and springs which are supposed to replicate chambers. Because halls will give you depth and height. Chambers are usually much smaller, and they give you width and sort of this space, this localized space. So that was the point of all of those. Well, no one has plates anymore. Well, I won't say that. There's this big thing in audio now where everything that's old is now new. So I just bought a console for $52. A Soundcraft Ghost console that I think when it was new was like $15,000, and I bought it for $52. And now I don't know why I did it. I think I did it just because I thought it was cool. And it's really not all that cool. Now I'm like, well, I have this big thing here that I'm never going to use. But people now still use springs, and they use plates, and people buy used plates. In fact, there's a YouTube video, which I should have downloaded to show you, where a dude took an IKEA table and turned it into a plate reverb, which was very interesting. I'm all about the IKEA hacks when it comes to these. But instead, we now use digital reverbs. And digital reverbs were just like the hall, the plate, and the spring. They were there to replicate the hall and the chamber. That's all it is. It's a replication. But now the digitals are there to replicate hall, chamber, plates, and springs, because no one has any of those. So now we have digital. This is one of the first digital reverbs, which I think is awesome. This is an EMT 250. It looks like something from Star Trek. It's fantastic. I've never actually touched one in person, but it kind of looks like a Macintosh, like a vacuum cleaner kind of, but I don't know, it's pretty neat. And what you do there is it's basically a plate simulator. And we'll look at this a little bit more, but it's what we call algorithmic reverbs. That means they use math. You guys like math? I don't like math. They use math to give us the echoes. Algorithmic. And then, of course, you got even fancier people who have created what is called convolution reverb, and some people call it impulse response reverb. So convolution reverb, what they do is they go into a real hall, like this one, okay? And they make a frequency sweep of this hall. So they put speakers in the hall. And then they would come in and you'd hear this, they'd excite the hall. And they'd have microphones to pick up that excited hall. And then they turn it into this little impulse, which basically sounds like this. You hear all of those little extra echoes? That's what it picks up. And then it takes your audio and it places one of those convolutions on every sample. So this in itself really puts the sound into the space that you sampled. And this was a big, important step because what they did with this was they then were able to sample analog gear and old digital gear. So you can actually go online and get digital samples of a Lexicon 480L, which is like a $6,000 reverb that you can't fix anymore because it came out in 1978. No, I take that back, 82, right? But people love it because it's old and old is new, so it's fantastic. But you know, no one in their right mind would really own one of these. So somebody went and sampled each sound on it, and you can play it through a convolution reverb, and it would sound pretty close. I mean, not exactly, but pretty close. Now we also have, like I use a company, and they're not sponsoring me by any way, so please don't feel like you need to go out and buy anything. But I use UAD plugins, Universal Audio plugins, which their big thing is they digitally represent actual analog gear. So they go in and they try to recreate everything about that piece of gear in the digital world. And they have a bunch of reverbs, but they're not necessarily convolution. So convolution reverb is used in a very different way than the other reverbs. So we're going to talk about that. Okay? So here's we get to our technique part, where everybody falls asleep. Technique. There are two ways to use reverb. I say this, let me put this a different way. Right now, I am going to teach you two ways. These are the ways that I use reverb. However, that does not preclude you from finding a new third way and calling it something cool, and everybody will start using it, okay? Right? There are just ways that have been done, and there are ways that doesn't mean you can't figure out a new way, okay? But I will give you sort of the pros and cons of each. Okay, so the first one is called the parallel effect. I'm the only one who ever calls it a parallel effect, but I'm hoping if I say it long enough, everybody else will also. So what a parallel effect is this is the traditional way. This is where we talk, where we said we put a speaker in the room and we took the sound from the speaker and the reverberation and brought it back. That is a parallel effect. It looks like this. So what we have here is we have your track, your audio that has been recorded, or maybe you are recording it. That then comes out, and we take a piece of it using what is called an auxiliary send. It's called an auxiliary send because it sends things to other places. That send would then, in a traditional way, go to that speaker in that room. The microphone would pick up said signal, and it would return it to the console. And that's called an auxiliary return. So you have a send and you have a return. And as you brought that return fader up, you would be blending in the reverberation. So you had your dry signal, which was your track untouched. Then you have your reverberant signal that comes in, that's blended in. Guess what? We now have parallel. It's a parallel effect. Lots of things are done this way. Okay? Reverb, though, was the big one. The other big one that happens a lot now, especially if you watch YouTube a lot, is that everybody is just incensed. They love the parallel compression. Some people call it New York drum compression, because apparently it was invented in New York for drums, which is not actually true. It was invented in New York for rap artists, not drummers. So there you go. No. Side chaining is different. But a parallel compression is the same thing. You have your dry signal, untouched. And then you have super compressed signal that blends in with it in a parallel stream. could be, yeah. So usually that's just a double, but yes. Actually, no. Yes, that is. Because I learned a lot when I started working with hip hop artists. And one of the things was back in the day when they were first recording the hip hop artists, you know, in the Bronx, right? That's where hip hop was born. They weren't very good, right? They didn't know how to do what they would. They could do it, but they didn't know. They didn't have. It wasn't a craft yet. Does that make sense? Like they didn't know how to use their voice, and so they would have this very thin sound. And so what the recording engineers would do is they would sit there and the producers and they would sit there and they go, okay, that was really good, but let's do this one more time, right? And we're gonna record this one. But they had recorded the last one. And so what they did was they recorded the second track. So now the vocal had been recorded twice. And that's called double tracking, right? And they use, you know, if you're a fan of Boston, right? Double track those, they quadruple track those guitars. Same thing. But what it does when you line them up next to each other, it makes the voice stronger and thicker. And so someone said, well, there's got to be a way to do this without having them double track this stuff. And that's where they invented this parallel compression. What they did was they took that one signal, duplicated it, altered it, and then fed it back in. And created sort of another double that made things thicker and more punchy. That's the compression thing. Although you can ask that question to the compression guy and he'll tell you if I'm wrong, okay? However, reverb has been like this all the time. This is how reverb was meant to be used. It was meant to be used in a parallel manner. So you could control the dry signal, which is the direct signal, along with the reverberation. You could put a lot of it. The more you put on it, the further back, the further your voice would go into the texture or whatever you were doing. The less of it, the more it came up. And you could actually blend multiple instruments. And what does that allow you to do? If you have a band, that means you could you could blend the guitars further back from your vocalist. So when you close your eyes, all of a sudden the vocalist feels like they're in front and the guitars take a step back. All because you added more reverb to the guitars than the vocals. So having that control is fantastic. It also means that you only need to have one reverb plugin. Okay? Sometimes or more if you wanted more. But the other way is called an insert effect. I guarantee you this is how most of you probably use reverb. You take your reverb plugin, you stick it on your vocal track, and there it is, right? And there's like a little mix button or knob that you can go back and forth and say, what's the ratio of dry to wet? And that, you know, it doesn't work very well. And the other problem is that if you want multiple reverb effects, that means you have to put one reverb effect on every channel, which nowadays isn't very big. But when I started out, I had a top of the line laptop that was a whole gigahertz, and, you know, had 500 megabytes of RAM and was fantastically fast. And boy, you couldn't have more than like one reverb running without your computer smoking. So you just couldn't do it. And now you can kind of do it, but it's still not super easy. You don't want to have a lot of those effects running all at once, but you can do this. So it uses a direct to wet mix within the plugin. I don't recommend doing things this way unless you're doing something very specific. Okay, this works really well. So this effect works really well when you're doing music. Okay, that you want it to sound real. If you're doing music or anything else that is like sound design, then this would be the way you would do it. Because you're not going for something real. You're going with something that sounds different. Like you're going for something that might not be real. You could, yes. Now, if you want to do like Phil Collins snare drum, gated reverb, now that actually is a parallel effect. Because does everybody listen to Phil Collins before? That's all you need to know. Oh, you need to get on Spotify right now. Like just harmonized snare. Gosh, I don't know. I've never heard of a harmonized snare. I don't know. But like, so like what a gated snare drum is, what a gated snare reverb. So the Phil Collins Genesis, when he took over Genesis, you would hear that do 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 do, that kind of sound. It was very like reverberant, but like it cut off. That's called gated reverb. And what that was from is because he's playing in a room, right? And the recording engineer has a talkback microphone. And that talkback microphone is in his room. And he would talk back to Phil while he was playing. And every time he pressed that button, Phil Collins would get the sound of his snare drum coming through the talkback mic in the room, so it captured the sound of the room. And then every time he'd lift up the button for talkback, the gate would cut off the reverb, because that's the way it works. And so Phil Collins was listening to him, and he would hear this choom, 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 choom kind of sound, and he's like, that's cool. How do we do that in real life? And so that's how it came about. It was actually a mistake. Like everything we do is a mistake. So really, if you wanted a reverberant effect on a snare drum, you would probably do it this way, unless you wanted to really change the way the snare drum sounded. Like if you wanted to create a harmonized snare drum, I don't even know what that is, but if you wanted to really mess with something, like really make it sound weird and different, this is the way to go. Right? So you have those two. So let's look at, before I get too wrapped up. Now, I'm just going to show you some of this stuff. Normally I would play this, and I could do it a little bit, but as we noticed, this room is super reverberant upon itself. So as soon as, like for instance, this is what a guitar sounds like in a hall, just to let you know. Very nice, pleasant. So if we wanted to add reverb to this guitar, we could just put a microphone in the room. And it's playing through the speakers. Of course, one of the speakers is way off in that corner. And it's creating its own reverb. Because watch when I hit stop. You hear how it goes away? I'll make it louder. So what we have there is we have an actual hall giving us reverb for this particular guitar. Okay? Now, what I was going to show you was actually feeding the guitar into an actual reverb. We can try it, but it's going to sound like a mess. But here are some UAD plugins that are actually models of the real thing. So this is a spring reverb. And so this is what I've done. I'll just move this over a little bit. Here is the guitar. Okay, they're possibly recording this on YouTube, so I will not have the vocalist. So my artist does not get mad that I just released her song on YouTube before we released it. There you go. We'll bring you in. So this is what I've done. In Pro Tools, if you are familiar, let me make this a little smaller. These are our inserts. These are our plugins. These are what our signal effects are. The vocalist and the guitarist both have compressors on them, just to level it out. Over here are our sends. These are our auxiliary sends. So what I've done is I've set up that situation where we have the dry signal, which is the guitar, and then we have this one right here, which is our send. What I'm doing is I'm sending it to this fake plug-in spring reverb, which is on my reverb bus right here. And then this is now my return. So what I can do here is, where is it? So here, right, if you see that little fader, this is my return. How much reverb am I using? So let's see what happens. Okay, now watch what happens when I add in more reverb. So right now this is reverberating, but we can't hear it. I personally cannot find it. But maybe you guys can, because you're in the phone. Okay, but this is, you hear how it really let out. That was the reverb half. That was the spring. All right, so that's what a spring reverb does. But notice how I'm using it in that parallel context. I'm bringing it onto a separate thing. So if I turn that one off, and this is the EMT plugin. So this is actually the controls for a reverb, for a EMT plate. So I can do the same exact thing. So I'll bring the reverb down. And we can, I don't know, pick something weird. See what that sounds like. Now when I bring this in, let me go back to factory default. So this is a plate. And I'll hit stop. See how plates, now you can control the reverberation time by moving things up and down here. Right now it's set at like 3 seconds-ish. So but the longer that reverb tail is, the longer the hall it's in. Just like this one. Right, we're like at a minute, like we're at like a 1.7 seconds. But with a plate, all you get is this long reverberant tunnel of sound. Plates are probably the most used reverb in pop music, hands down. It's the sound that we want to hear on vocals. It just is. Can't get around it. Everybody uses it. Okay? Plates are the thing, and it's because it doesn't give you any other cues. It's just this long length, this long gap. Now, that's a plate sound. So here's the plate again. Also notice really like washy kind of sound. It's very with the spring. We brought the spring in. That one has a sort of a different feel to it, right? It still rings quite long, but it's like a different kind of sound to it. Now, here is this is a digital reverb, okay? And notice how the digital, if you look at the digital reverb, it says small, medium, large, very large, all of these different things. And when you look in here, they are rooms, like a guitar studio, a bright, airy chamber for strings, all of this stuff. But also notice down here, it'll say a vintage oil can, which, you know, I don't know, might sound cool. Where else do we have here? We have a horn plate. So this is a plate that, you know, maybe someone would put on a horn section, trumpets, trombones, whatever. So this algorithmic reverb is trying to create all of those other reverbs. And so we can pick anything from here. Black hole? Where was that? All right. So this is what black hole sounds like. It's 20 seconds. So this is like, it's almost like you're in well, I wouldn't say an outdoor space. Outdoor spaces don't really have reverb because they're outdoors. But see, it's still decaying over here. It's still moving. But let's see if we can hear something that is small. So how it's very, very small. Now in this room, it's going to be really hard to hear that. But typically, when you're doing a recording, we will use 3 reverbs. The first reverb will be a very small reverb, which is actually used to put you further away from the microphone, okay, in our heads. Because when we recorded it, we might have done this, right? We're talking like this, we're recording like this, and it sounds like I'm right up in your face. Well, we want it to sound like this. So that extra 6 inches can be had by using a small room. And then after the small room, so we would have 3 reverb buses. The first one might be the small reverb bus. The second one might be a plate, and that would give us some depth. So you have width followed by depth. And then you might use a hall to give us sort of a more airy, really large feel. Yes? Yes, they're all parallel. So we have one dry signal feeding every single one of them in different ratios in order to achieve a specific feel. Yes? Maybe. The small room, we want the early reflections. That's what we would use. But because the small room would have only ones. And that's why I generally, for the length one, I use a plate, because I don't have to worry about early reflections. But yes, you could turn them on. Yes? Pre-delay and being very careful with how much you use and how much you send to them. So for instance, I would never send a bass drum, kick drum, to a reverb, ever. Because that's not its purpose. Its purpose, unless, we're talking like musical context here. It's not its purpose. Its purpose is to give rhythm. It's not to be in a room, right? I also probably wouldn't put a bass necessarily in a plate either, because the boominess would just kill it. But you have to be careful with how much you're using and really try to be wary of how much you're using. The other thing that you can do, which I haven't shown you here, is there's no reason that you couldn't put an equalization plugin right after your reverb. So now what's happening is you're exciting the reverb, okay? It's creating this sound. And then you're using an equalizer to hone that reverberant tail so it doesn't muddy your mix. So you can very, very easily do that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, how do you want it? Well, no, I've never done it. I'm assuming you're EDM, right? Yeah. Okay. So I no, but what he's doing, what he's talking about, what he's talking about, and it's good that you're using Ableton. Very good. Industry standard now. Sorry, Fruity Loops is just, after they had to call it Fruity Loops, they can't call it that anymore. No, just kidding. Have a seat. No, but what he's talking about is side chaining is when you use one signal to control the output of a plugin. So, like, I forget who asked. You did about side chaining a compressor. So if you want your music to pump, like everything goes like this, what you can do is you can take your kick drum and you can side chain your compressor with the kick drum. And so every time the kick drum hits, the music goes and it just dips. Yeah, and you're just going like this, and it starts to bounce with it. Okay. As far as it, you got to be careful with doing that a lot. One, it's because a lot of people use it and it's becoming a thing. And two, sensitive, like it starts, like when I listen to music like that, I start going like this, and I'm now like becoming seasick just a little bit. So you have to be careful with that. But when he's side chaining a reverb, so you're trying to get the reverb to wash in, right? This is what you want. This is what you want. Yeah, so pre-delay is how we separate our dry signal from the reverberation. So right now, this pre-delay is at 12 milliseconds. So you're going to hear the sound, and then you're going to hear the reverberation. Okay? And that helps muddiness a lot. And that will, that will help you a lot. And what you should do is, because you're doing EDM, very rhythmic music, electronic dance music, right? Calculate how much, well, this one does it for me, I think. Maybe not. Calculate how much time a quarter note is, how much time a half note is, how much all of those are, so that when you go ahead and do this, your pre-delay is actually in time with the beat of your music, and then all of a sudden your vocal will pop right out of it. It'll work really well. All right, last thing. I've got 5 minutes. Less than 5 minutes now. 4 minutes. The last way that you can use this as an insert effect. So here's my 2-bus. This is sort of where all of my music is coming in and combining into a stereo signal. I've put this reverb on the 2-bus. So what's happening is I'm doing what I told you that you shouldn't do, which is use reverberation as an insert effect. And what this does is in post-production. So if you want something to sound like, oh, I don't know, that it's being played in a BMW X5 SUV with the doors closed. Now, it's really hard for you to tell because there it is. So it's like the guitarist is sitting in the X5 BMW, right? Now, I don't know why it's so utterly specific in this program, but that's the thing, though. With this particular program, this is a convolution reverb. They use this in post-production. So if you are doing a video game soundtrack and somebody has said, we need this to sound like they're in, in someone's bedroom or in the living room or something, that voiceover that you're doing, you can send directly to a convolution reverb, blend in the dry to blend in reverberant to dry sound, and it will sound, because it's convolution, it will sound like it is in that room, which is super important. So for instance, a classical record, like a classical orchestra, might take an impulse of their hall. Okay? They take that impulse, they record crowd noise, and then when they want to do a live recording, a live CD, they take all 4 nights that they recorded it, they edit them together, and if they still have a mistake, they will bring the orchestra back into the hall. They will record it. They will then run it through the convolution reverb and then edit it in. And basically, they put the people back in the hall and they put the orchestra in the hall, and now it's blended in seamlessly. So that is what convolution does. The reason why it's so hard to use it in a normal context as this is because you would have to put one of these plugins on every single track of the mix to make it sound like they were all there. Well, there's a problem with that. These take a lot of CPU resources, and like a typical hip hop track has got 175 tracks maybe. It's crazy amounts. And that's just a lot. That's a lot of CPU power. So these are very specialized. I use these if I'm trying to emulate a piece of gear or if I'm trying to put somebody in a very specific place. Like Altaverb is like hands down the industry standard. I don't own it, so we're using Pro Tools Space Reverb. But you can do all of that using a convolution. But it's used as an insert effect. Now, if you pull the dry all the way down, like that, now you could use this as an aux effect also. But again, it is very, very CPU intensive. All right. Well, I'm getting the hook. Wrap it up. There we go. So we've got to call it for today. However, if you have any questions, any comments or whatever, just come up and ask, and I will talk. All right. Thank you. Thanks for coming.